High above the earth, a quiet battle was unfolding, one that would shift the balance of power between East and West. President Ibrahim Traoré's flight to Moscow, intended as a simple diplomatic mission, was suddenly intercepted by American and French fighter jets. But in the skies, an unexpected ally arrived, risking a confrontation that could change history. What happens next will send shockwaves through the world. It was a calm morning in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The sun was shining brightly as President Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk in the presidential palace going over the final details of his upcoming trip. He had been invited by President Vladimir Putin to Moscow, where he would attend the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. The occasion would include a grand military parade in Red Square, a powerful symbol of Russia's strength and resilience. This was a big moment for Ibrahim. It wasn't just about attending a celebration. It was about making a bold statement to the world. Since taking office, he had worked tirelessly to reclaim Burkina Faso's sovereignty, distancing his country from the influence of Western powers. His growing ties with Russia were seen by many as a move toward true independence, a defiance of the old imperial powers that had long controlled Africa's destiny. In the West, there was no hiding the growing anxiety. The United States and France, both nations with long-standing interests in Africa, had made it clear that they disapproved of Burkina Faso's increasing alignment with Russia. In private meetings, U.S. and French officials had warned that any actions threatening their influence in the region would not be tolerated. As Ibrahim prepared for his flight, he knew that this journey would not just be a diplomatic trip. It was a test, a challenge to the powers that had dominated Africa for so long. Would they allow him to reach Russia and attend the event? Or would they do whatever it took to prevent him from making this bold move? The moment the plane took off from Ouagadougou, Ibrahim knew the stakes were higher than ever. The crew was on high alert, knowing that the flight could be interrupted at any time. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Ibrahim leaned back in his seat, looking out at the vast African landscape disappearing below. He was heading toward a new chapter for Burkina Faso, but as he would soon learn, the skies above were about to become the scene of a dramatic confrontation. Hours into the flight, everything seemed normal. Ibrahim's plane glided smoothly through the sky, the rhythmic hum of the engines soothing against the quiet murmur of the crew. However, as the plane flew across the Atlantic, a strange signal appeared on the radar, 2 dots moving quickly, heading toward his flight. The crew of the plane tensed. They immediately recognized the shapes on their radar: military jets moving fast and intercepting the flight path of Ibrahim's plane. These were no ordinary commercial aircraft. These were American and French fighter jets. At first, the pilots believed it might have been a mistake. But as the jets came closer, the situation became clear. It was an interception. There was no mistake. Ibrahim sat in silence, his eyes narrowing as he watched the jets approach. His mind raced. He had prepared for opposition, but this was unexpected. The radio crackled, and a stern voice from the U.S. military ordered, "This is a restricted airspace. You are ordered to land immediately. You are crossing into restricted airspace. Repeat, land immediately." Ibrahim leaned forward in his seat, eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was an act of defiance. The U.S. and France were clearly trying to prevent his trip to Russia, to stop him from attending the celebration of victory in Moscow. But Ibrahim Traoré was not one to back down from a challenge. The pilots glanced at each other, waiting for instructions. Ibrahim knew what needed to be done. His country's sovereignty and the message he was carrying were too important to let them be threatened by foreign forces. He looked out the window, seeing the American and French jets moving in, closer, their positions locking around his plane. "I will not land," Ibrahim said quietly to his captain. "Continue on course. We are not diverting." The crew nodded in understanding. They knew this wasn't just a flight. It was a statement. But the risks were high. The situation could escalate quickly. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, a new sound filled the air. The unmistakable roar of jet engines, this time coming from a different direction. A squadron of Russian fighter jets appeared on Ibrahim's radar, moving in swiftly to provide air support. As the Russian jets flew close, the Western forces were forced to reconsider their position. They had come with the intention of stopping Traoré's flight, but now they were facing off with Russia, a country not easily intimidated. After hours of tense negotiation, the American and French forces reluctantly backed down. Their jets withdrew, retreating from the airspace, leaving Ibrahim's plane to continue its journey to Russia. The standoff had ended, but the implications of what had just happened would reverberate for years to come. Ibrahim Traoré's flight to Russia had become a symbol of defiance, an undeniable statement that Burkina Faso would no longer be bullied or intimidated. With Russia's support, Ibrahim had faced down the power of two Western superpowers and won. As the plane moved smoothly through the sky again, Ibrahim leaned back in his seat, his mind still racing. The danger had passed, but he knew that the world was watching. The flight to Russia was more than just a diplomatic trip. It was a bold statement to the world. Burkina Faso was free, and no one was going to stop it. The hours following the dramatic interception in the skies felt like an eternity for Ibrahim Traoré. His plane had been surrounded by American and French military jets, a show of force meant to prevent him from reaching Russia. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and every passing minute seemed to bring them closer to an international incident. Despite the looming threat, Ibrahim remained calm. His eyes stayed focused on the horizon, even as the Western jets moved closer to his plane. The radio crackled again, breaking the silence. A cold, firm voice came through this time from the U.S. military command. "President Traoré, this is the United States Air Force. You are in violation of restricted airspace. You must divert your flight path immediately. Failure to comply will result in direct consequences." Ibrahim's eyes narrowed. He had expected some form of resistance, but this was far beyond what he had imagined. The Americans and French were acting with unprecedented aggression, as if they were determined to stop him at all costs. The mission, which was supposed to be a peaceful diplomatic visit, was now becoming a standoff. His mind raced through his options. He could feel the weight of history on his shoulders. The entire world was watching now, though they might not know it yet. If he gave in, it would be a symbol of Africa's continued subjugation to foreign powers. But if he stood his ground, he would send a powerful message, one that would shake the foundations of global politics. "I will not land," Ibrahim said, his voice steady but resolute. "We continue on course. Do not divert." His words hung in the air, and the captain of the plane nodded in agreement, already knowing what was at stake. The pilots and crew had been briefed on the importance of this flight, and now they would have to carry it through, no matter the risk. Minutes passed like hours as the Western jets flanked Ibrahim's plane. The air around them felt heavy with anticipation. The situation had escalated. Any sudden move could spark a confrontation between superpowers. But just as it seemed like the tension would break, a new voice crackled through the radio, cutting through the standoff like a lightning bolt. "This is Russian Air Command. We have received instructions to escort President Traoré to his destination. Move your jets out of the way. Do not engage." The tone of the Russian voice was commanding, and its arrival was as sudden as it was unexpected. The American and French jets hesitated, their pilots no doubt surprised by the sudden appearance of Russian fighters on their radar. In the skies, Russian jets were not just supporting an African leader, they were sending a clear message to the Western powers. "I repeat," the Russian voice continued, "President Traoré's plane is under our protection. We will not allow any interference with his flight." As the Russian jets moved into position, the Western planes took a step back. The dynamics had changed completely. What had started as an aggressive move by the United States and France now seemed to be a dangerous game of brinkmanship that neither side wanted to escalate further. The Western forces, faced with the presence of Russian military might, found themselves with little choice but to withdraw. For a few more tense moments, the two sides faced each other in the sky. But slowly, the American and French jets pulled back. The Russian planes held their ground, ensuring that Ibrahim's plane could continue its journey toward Russia. The standoff had ended without a shot being fired, but the world had just witnessed a dramatic shift. Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, had defied Western power, and the support of Russia had been the decisive factor. For Ibrahim, this moment was about more than just a flight to Moscow. It was a powerful message about Africa's place in the world, a defiant stand against imperialism that would echo far beyond the skies. As the plane resumed its flight path and the Russian jets maintained their protective formation, Ibrahim leaned back in his seat, allowing himself a moment of reflection. The worst was over, but the significance of what had just happened weighed heavily on him. This was no longer just a diplomatic mission. This was a turning point for Burkina Faso and for all of Africa. Ibrahim's flight to Moscow had become something more than a simple trip. It was a powerful statement to the world. Africa would no longer be silenced. With the backing of Russia, Burkina Faso had sent a clear message. Sovereignty, freedom, and independence were non-negotiable. The journey continued, but the implications of this dramatic confrontation would be felt for years to come. As the plane headed for Moscow, Ibrahim knew that the message had been sent loud and clear. Africa was no longer passive. It was taking its place in the world as a powerful, independent force. The world had just watched as two superpowers stood against each other all over a simple flight. And in the end, it was Ibrahim Traoré, with the support of Russia, who had won the day. The hours following the dramatic interception felt like an eternity. Ibrahim Traoré sat in his seat, still trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The American and French jets, initially a threat to his journey, had backed down. The sky above, which had been a battleground between global powers, was now silent again, the only sound the steady hum of the plane's engines. But the world had just witnessed an unprecedented moment. A leader from Burkina Faso, a small African nation, had stood his ground against two of the most powerful forces in the world with the support of Russia. As the plane cruised smoothly toward Moscow, Ibrahim thought about what this would mean. He had been part of history, but this was not just a personal victory. It was a victory for Africa as a whole. It proved that when African leaders stood firm when they were backed by strong allies like Russia, they could challenge the long-standing imperialism that had held the continent in chains for centuries. The confrontation in the sky was more than a physical standoff. It was a symbolic moment, one that would inspire African leaders and citizens for generations to come. The crew of Ibrahim's plane had done their job guiding the plane through turbulent skies and ensuring that the president's message was clear. As the situation de-escalated, the captain of the plane allowed himself a moment of relief. The worst had passed. The Western forces had withdrawn, and they were now clear to continue the flight. But even as the skies grew calm, there was no mistaking the fact that what had just transpired was not just an isolated event. It was part of a larger global struggle, a struggle for independence, sovereignty, and for Africa to finally take its place on the world stage without interference from foreign powers. Burkina Faso, led by Ibrahim Traoré, had now become the focal point of that struggle. Hours later, Ibrahim's plane touched down in Moscow, its destination finally reached after the tension-filled journey. The grand airstrip of Vnukovo Airport greeted him, and the sight of Russian officials waiting for his arrival was a reminder that he had come through not just an ordinary diplomatic mission, but a symbolic victory for Africa. President Vladimir Putin was among those waiting on the tarmac to greet him. The Russian president's face broke into a warm smile as he extended his hand to Ibrahim. The two leaders shook hands firmly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the heat of that confrontation in the sky. "Welcome to Russia, President Traoré Putin," said his voice calm and sincere. "It's a privilege to have you here." Ibrahim nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you, President Putin. It's an honor to be here." Ibrahim's arrival in Moscow was not just for political meetings. It coincided with a significant national event. The 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II was being celebrated with a grand military parade in Red Square, one of the most iconic and powerful events in Russian history. As they stood watching the military procession unfold before them, Ibrahim couldn't help but think about the larger symbolism of the event. Here, in the heart of Russia, military might was on full display, a clear message to the world of Russian strength and resilience. But it wasn't just Russia's strength that impressed him. It was the resilience of nations that had been through history's hardest battles and now stood firm unbowed by foreign dominance. "Russia has always stood against imperialism," Ibrahim said quietly to Putin as they watched the parade. "This is what Africa needs, the courage to stand firm, no matter the pressure, the will to protect our sovereignty." Putin nodded. "You are right, President Traoré. The struggle for sovereignty, for independence, is one that never ends. But those who stand firm, who refuse to bow to external pressure, will find their place in history. Russia stands with you." Though the grand parade continued in Red Square, Ibrahim knew that the victory of the day was not just about the military display. It was about the message that had been sent both in the air and on the ground. The confrontation in the skies above had shown the world that Burkina Faso was no longer a passive player in international politics. With Russia's backing, the country had stood its ground against two superpowers, and in doing so, it had sent a loud, clear message about Africa's right to self-determination. The significance of the moment was not lost on Ibrahim. As he stood there in the heart of Russia, he realized that this was more than just a diplomatic visit. It was the beginning of a new era for Africa, one in which the continent's leaders could chart their own course without fear of outside interference. The celebrations continued in Moscow. But for Ibrahim, the true victory had already been won. Africa was no longer willing to be silenced, and with Russia by its side, the continent had found its voice. While the celebrations in Moscow was being broadcast to the world, what had transpired high above the clouds remained a secret. The dramatic confrontation between the U.S., France, and Russia was never reported. Only a few high-ranking Russian officials and military personnel knew the full extent of the standoff. The world would never know how close the situation had come to escalating into something much larger, but what mattered was that the confrontation had ended peacefully, with Burkina Faso's sovereignty intact. The days that followed Ibrahim Traoré's arrival in Moscow were filled with ceremonies, meetings, and moments of reflection. The significance of the confrontation in the skies, which had only been witnessed by a few, was now understood by everyone in the room. Russia had publicly shown its support for Burkina Faso, and the world could feel the tremors of this new partnership. But for Ibrahim, this visit was about more than just attending a military parade. It was a bold statement that Africa could stand independently free from foreign influence. The morning after the grand military parade, Ibrahim found himself at a ceremonial breakfast with President Putin and other Russian officials. The atmosphere was warm, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. They both knew the gravity of the situation, the consequences of what had happened in the skies. It wasn't just about a diplomatic visit to Moscow anymore. It was about the future of Africa and the world's changing balance of power. Putin's tone was thoughtful. As he spoke, his eyes fixed on Ibrahim. Your journey here, President Traoré, is a reminder to the world that Africa is no longer a pawn in global politics. The fight for Africa's sovereignty and independence is something that every nation should respect. We stand with you. Ibrahim listened carefully. He had always admired Putin's pragmatism and strength, but today he understood the depth of their alliance. It wasn't just about military support or economic partnerships. It was about a shared vision for a world where the sovereignty of nations was respected no matter their size or influence. And now, Burkina Faso and Russia had stood together, a powerful reminder of that unity. Later that day, President Putin invited Ibrahim to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where they met with diplomats and key figures in Russia's political sphere. It was here that Putin extended a symbolic offer to Ibrahim. I would like to extend an invitation not just to you, but to the people of Africa. If you wish, we can build a stronger partnership between our nations. Let this be the beginning of a new chapter of cooperation. Ibrahim, impressed by the gesture, responded with a nod. This invitation represents more than just politics. It represents the future. We are building something new, a future where African nations can choose their own path without fear or interference from outside forces. The offer was clear. Russia was willing to partner with Burkina Faso and, by extension, all of Africa. The idea of African unity and Pan-African cooperation was more than just a vision. It was becoming a reality. This was a turning point in the struggle for African sovereignty. As the day unfolded, Ibrahim Traoré realized that his visit to Russia had done more than just secure an alliance with one of the world's most powerful nations. It had reignited a fire of Pan-African unity. During a public speech to a gathered crowd of Russian and African diplomats, he spoke about the struggle for Africa's independence. We are no longer afraid of standing alone, he said, his voice strong and filled with conviction. Today, we stand with Russia not as subjects but as equals. Our nations have fought for their freedom for generations, and we are determined to secure our future. We are calling on all African nations to join us in this struggle, to stand together for a future where our sovereignty is never again in question. His words were met with applause, and the room filled with energy. There was a sense of hope in the air, a feeling that for the first time Africa had a true ally, and that the path forward was one they would walk together. Ibrahim's message echoed far beyond the walls of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The news spread across the globe, and in the hearts of African people everywhere, a new sense of pride and possibility began to grow. The invitation was clear. It was time for African nations to unite to stand together and to demand the respect they deserved on the world stage. The speech, while powerful in its own right, wasn't just a call to action for Burkina Faso. It was a call for every African leader and every citizen to consider the importance of sovereignty, independence, and unity. Ibrahim Traoré had shown that, with strong alliances like that of Russia, the power dynamics of the world could shift. The future of Africa, once dictated by the whims of imperial powers, was now in the hands of its leaders and its people. Months passed, and the world moved on from the incident. Publicly, there was little mention of the confrontation in the air between the U.S., France, and Russia. It was swept under the rug, and for all the speeches and celebrations that followed Ibrahim's trip to Russia, the true nature of the standoff remained classified. But for Ibrahim Traoré, the significance of that moment could never be erased. It was a moment that proved to him and to the world that Africa's destiny was in its own hands. The world could ignore the confrontation in the skies, but Ibrahim would never forget it. It was a defining moment, one that showed the strength of Burkina Faso, the support of Russia, and the growing unity of Africa in the face of imperialism. And although the information remained secret, the impact of the event was undeniable. The world had seen the courage of Africa's leaders, and the winds of change were beginning to blow. In the weeks following his return from Moscow, President Ibrahim Traoré found himself reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The flight to Russia had started as a diplomatic mission, but had turned into something much larger, a defining moment in the struggle for African sovereignty. The confrontation in the sky had changed the course of his journey, but it had also changed the course of history. Back in Burkina Faso, the news was filled with praise for Traoré's strength and resolve. He had faced down two superpowers, refused to bow to foreign pressure, and emerged victorious with the backing of Russia. The world watched as the stories of his encounter with the U.S. and France slowly became legend, an inspiring tale of defiance and courage that resonated with people across Africa. The events surrounding Ibrahim's trip to Moscow sparked a renewed sense of pride across the continent. African leaders began to take notice of what had happened. Here was a leader who had stood firm against Western interference and had been supported by Russia, showing that Africa could stand on its own and protect its interests. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about every African nation. The message was clear. No longer would Africa remain a passive player in global politics, subject to the whims of foreign powers. No longer would its leaders be dictated to or silenced. The time had come for Africa to rise unite and shape its own future. The diplomatic relationships between African countries and Russia grew stronger as the weeks went by, as did the sense of unity among African nations. Countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Algeria, which had long fought for independence from colonial rule, now found themselves looking to Burkina Faso as an example of how to assert sovereignty in the face of foreign pressure. Ibrahim Traoré had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for leaders and citizens alike, showing that Africa could fight back against the forces of imperialism. Ibrahim's trip to Moscow also marked the beginning of a new chapter for Burkina Faso. No longer isolated or dominated by Western powers, the country began to forge stronger economic and military ties with Russia. This newfound relationship opened the door for trade infrastructure development and military cooperation that would benefit Burkina Faso for years to come. Ibrahim knew that this partnership was just the start. Russia's support was invaluable, but he also understood the importance of diversification. He began to strengthen Burkina Faso's ties with other emerging global powers, seeking partnerships that would allow his country to thrive without relying on any one nation. In the coming months, he visited China, India, and other nations, building a web of alliances based on mutual respect and shared interests. Burkina Faso was becoming a force to be reckoned with not just in Africa, but on the global stage. However, the victory in the sky did not come without its costs. The Western powers, humiliated by their failure to stop Ibrahim's flight, were not quick to forget. Though the confrontation was never publicly acknowledged behind closed doors, Western diplomats and military leaders were discussing how to counteract the growing influence of countries like Russia in Africa. The economic pressures on Burkina Faso intensified as Western nations sought to punish the country for its defiance. Sanctions were imposed, and foreign aid began to dwindle. Despite this, Ibrahim remained steadfast. He knew that Africa's future was not dependent on foreign handouts, but on the resilience and self-sufficiency of its people. While the rest of the world may have forgotten the details of the confrontation, Ibrahim Traoré knew its significance. The victory in the sky had proven that no force could dictate Africa's destiny anymore. He had faced down two global superpowers with the support of Russia and emerged unscathed. But it wasn't just his personal victory. It was a victory for all African nations. As Ibrahim walked through the streets of Ouagadougou, greeted by his people with joy and admiration, he realized how much had changed. The people of Burkina Faso, who had once felt the weight of foreign dominance, were now walking with their heads held high. They knew that their president had stood up to the world's greatest powers and had won not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. In the years that followed, Ibrahim Traoré's leadership continued to inspire not only those in Burkina Faso, but across the African continent. His journey to Moscow had become more than a historical moment. It had become a symbol of the new Africa, united, strong, and determined to stand on its own. The calls for African unity grew louder, and more nations began to forge alliances with one another, breaking free from the chains of imperialism that had once held them in subjugation. Africa's voice, once silenced on the global stage, was now heard loud and clear. The message was simple but powerful. Africa was no longer a continent to be ignored. It was a continent to be respected. Ibrahim's legacy, built on the foundation of independence and sovereignty, had set a new course for Africa. And though the details of the confrontation in the sky would never be fully revealed, the spirit of that moment lived on in every leader and every citizen who believed that Africa's destiny was its own to shape. As Ibrahim looked toward the future, he knew that the journey wasn't over. The fight for Africa's true independence would continue. But the path had already been cleared. With unity, courage, and determination, Africa would rise, and the struggle for freedom would no longer be just a dream, but a reality. And as long as he was president, Ibrahim Traoré would stand firm, a guardian of Africa's future, never again willing to let the forces of imperialism dictate the course of his country or his continent.